So hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today where we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence for legal professionals demystified. I'm Caroline Hill, I'm Editor-in-Chief of Legal IT Insider, and we're here with a great crowd of people from all over the globe to talk about generative AI and where the pace and hype of innovation is dizzying. I think that's a fair word for it. Large language models, generative AI tools like ChatGPT can help law firms and legal departments automate routine tasks and enhance research and analysis. But should you be using Gen AI and how should you be using it? And here to help me demystify some of it, hopefully lots of it, are Dr. Andrew Fletcher and Zachary Warren from Thomson Reuters. Hi, Andrew. Hi, Zach.
Hello.
Hi. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. So Zachary leads tech and innovation content and research for the Thomson Reuters Institute. He's been writing and speaking on tech and innovation for more than a decade. He charts the future of professional services industries, including legal, tax, risk and fraud through writing, podcasts, speaking engagements and more. And within the Institute, Zach has helmed multiple research projects on technology in professional services, including a series of Gen AI reports for the legal and tax industries, which are the Digital Strategy Report for law firms and others. And before TRI, Zach was the editor-in-chief of ALM's Legal Tech News and regularly featured on law.com, The American Lawyer, and ALM events such as Legal Week. And Zach and I used to appear on a podcast together as well, didn't we, Zach?
We did, and that was a lot of fun. So it's great to be speaking with you. I think first time in a year and a half, maybe something like that.
Yeah, it's a long time. And Andrew is Director of AI Strategy and Partnerships with Thomson Reuters Labs. Andrew's based in London. Should have said Zach's based in the US. TR Labs is a global team of scientists and engineers building AI capabilities for TR's products. The AI strategy and partnerships function directly informs how TR partners to experiment with new and emerging technology, geared to anticipate and challenge strategic thinking across Thomson Reuters. And interestingly, Andrew founded the London Labs team, which is comprised of data scientists, designers, and engineers. He has a PhD and Masters in Chemistry from the University of Oxford, and before Thomson Reuters worked at Imperial College London. Is that a fair introduction, Andrew?
Seems pretty comprehensive. Yeah, that's me. Great to be here.
That's you. I'm quite envious. We have a clever one. I've already said just before we started the webinar, but a bit of housekeeping. Please enable your chat function if you're listening to this live. We've already had some people saying hi. We've got people from all over the world, and we will be sharing a recording of this. So if you're listening to this on the recording session, welcome as well. In terms of takeaways, we're looking at generative AI at a high level rather than at a product level. We very much welcome your questions, whatever they are, to be honest. If you put them in the chat, we'll aim to deal with them either now or in the future. So don't hold back. And in terms of the types of topics that we'll be covering during the session, we'll be looking at how the legal industry can move beyond Gen AI education to practical applications. We're going to look at where Gen AI can and should be used in legal work, both both non-legal and legal work, and what the difference is between Gen AI systems like ChatGPT and proprietary systems and why that matters, and then where the legal industry goes from here in trying to keep up with the pace of change. I'd like some advice on that. So let's just talk about the sort of, Zach, tell us a bit more about the sorts of research that you've been doing and done in terms of the surveys, etc.
Yeah, certainly. So a little bit of a sneak peek here, but we will be having a large generative AI report that'll be coming out in mid-April. And essentially what we were looking to do is honestly a lot of what you said there. It's not only getting the use cases, who's using it, who's not, what for, but kind of the sentiment around generative AI as well? Do people think that there are use cases within legal? Should this actively be used? Do people see ethical concerns, privacy concerns, accuracy concerns? What are those? How are they moving across them? As well as some of the business questions around this as well. How are people handling costs? Is this going to mean an increase in AFAs, the quote unquote death of the billable hour that everybody's been talking about forever? As well as we asked a lot of corporates, what do you want your firms to be doing? How do you want them to be approaching generative AI? So a lot of interesting stuff that came out of that I can talk about over the course of our webinar here. But I think the overarching top bullet point that I got is generative AI is here. People are interested in it, and they're starting to move beyond just the education piece to actually put some of those strategic plans into place. Not just saying, okay, what is this, but how is this going to work for me? A very important next step that I don't think there's really widespread adoption right now. It's not revolutionizing necessarily the legal industry, but people are starting to think about this in a lot more critical fashion than I think that they were this time last year.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing that. I think it's very hard to gauge where firms are at in practice. We hear probably about the firms that are doing more. So I tend to write about the firms that are doing more, but then when I engage privately with people are still very cautious. So it's kind of hard to gauge. I'll be fascinated to hear more of a deep dive about what you're hearing. Andrew, so tell us a bit more about your day job in terms of who you're speaking with, or how you sort of do your day, or who you're engaging with, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I suppose the day job of the labs, as you kind of described it in the introduction, we're building those AI capabilities that are in Thomson Reuters products. We've been doing that for a long time. So the origins of the group go back over 30 years, and generative AI is certainly kind of a new and kind of important component of what we're building for TR, but it sort of builds on those foundations of what we've been doing, to enhance our products over the years. But my role specifically, so we have a very clear AI strategy at Thomson Reuters. There's a clear kind of focus around how we partner, key acquisitions, like we acquired Casetext last year, for example, but also lots of organic building that we're doing to create those capabilities. And so my function really is to make sure that as the labs team and the scientists that we have, the research that we're doing is kind of geared towards that future that we're seeing for the evolution of our products. So of course it's what we're doing in the near term, but it's also thinking ahead to what comes next. And partnerships are an important part of that as well, because in Thomson Reuters we really bring a lot of value, but a key part of that value is around the content we have, and that content coming from the subject matter experts we have. So the legally trained, and also on the other side of the business, the tax trained professionals who we have curating and adding value to our content. So when we're looking at partnership opportunities, both with smaller organizations, but also with the big techs, the ones you can imagine. I won't sort of name the names, but we're sort of really talking to them about different ways that we can embed that content and expertise in different ways to kind of continue to push the thresholds of where these AI capabilities can take us. So, there's lots of exciting things going on, even beyond the exciting things that we're releasing in our products as well.
Thank you. I have to say, I've written about Thomson Reuters more than average. You're obviously doing some really interesting stuff. I've written about the Co-Counsel a lot, and obviously you're extending that out. I know we're not going to talk about product particularly, but it's interesting to note. I wrote about your integration with Copilot, which was really interesting. You're doing some great stuff. So where do you? I'm going to come back. Keep posting your questions. I see there's a question. I'm not ignoring you. Just if you keep, we sort of get going and then we'll come back to some questions, but please keep posting them in the chat. That's great. So Zach, we touched on this sort of slightly just now, do you think it's the case, either of you, that law firms, where do you think they are in their journey in terms of talking about it or sort of practical implementation? I personally, by now, would expect people to be very much with vendors, probably exploring practical use cases. That's my would be my hope or expectation. Is that wrong in terms of reality, do you think?
I think that's pretty accurate where people are right now. But one thing that we did find interesting in the research, at least to me, was that on an organizational level, only less than 20% said either their firms or corporate legal departments had wide-scale generative AI adoption. But then when we flipped that slightly and said, have you played around on a personal level with either ChatGPT or some other generative AI tool, that shot up to nearly half of people either have played around with it or they said, oh, we know that this is going to be a part of my work in the next 2-3 years or so. I think most people have an understanding what this is at this point, which think about all sorts of legal technologies dating back a decade or more. Legal, for better or worse, had a reputation of being slow to adopt. I don't think that's the case with generative AI. I think people kind of saw pretty instantly, oh, there's a there. And as a result, we're starting to play around with a chat GPT, maybe not, but hopefully not putting in any client information or anything like that, but even just saying, write me an email and seeing what this is about. So as a result, I think we're accelerating the normal adoption curve of what we usually see with technology. And as a result, even though we're a year and a half away from ChatGPT going public in the first place, I think a lot of people within legal are starting to have exactly those conversations you talked about, okay, talking with vendors, talking with others about where can this fit into practice.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrew, were you going to add us something?
Yeah, I mean, I have lots of thoughts here, so I'll try to keep it brief because I could sort of there's so many kind of dimensions to this, but I think sort of you know, as part of my role, I also kind of am lucky to have opportunity to kind of come out and talk to people about Gen AI a lot. And, I think one of the things that's kind of really crystal clear in my mind is that there is a huge spectrum of where people are on that AI journey. I think it's sort of, there's a danger that I'll sort of sit here in my AI bubble and think that everyone's, all in and sort of racing ahead. But I think we are obviously seeing a spectrum, and I think there was sort of some trailblazers, in terms of firms and corporate legal departments last year who were sort of racing ahead with some of their own experimentation. But I think sort of there's a real advantage, now, I think sort of 2024 is the year of kind of moving to production, moving beyond POC to production. And certainly kind of for us in TR, Gen AI capabilities are coming kind of embedded in our core products. And I think that sort of kind of helps with that sort of adoption. It's kind of less of a sort of having to kind of be that trailblazer, which I think is really important. But I think sort of we should also remember that one of the kind of key things of this roller coaster from the last year and a half has been that the barrier to entry has been reduced. I think sort of it used to be that AI was sort of spoken about as this mystical thing where you'd sort of come up with an idea and then you'd need to go off for a few weeks or months and cook up something that you could use to test. Whereas now, as Zach said, you can just type in write me an email about X and you'll get something back. And so I think that's driven a real curiosity among people. I mean, hopefully that's why people are here today, is that they're curious. They have been sort of diving into it. But I think that's really transformed the conversation about where AI is bringing value, what it is. All these sort of questions around adoption. But I think sort of we are also now kind of seeing that kind of more standardization of ways in which you can access and use this capability in existing products, like the TR ones, but also you mentioned Copilot as well, sort of bringing those capabilities into the tools people are already using is actually a sort of next step to kind of enabling you to explore further.
I do think that's the way for firms. You know, a lot of firms don't have the resources of some of the firms that we saw last year who were building their own, you know, and the sort of the trailblazers, as you say. Imagine that a lot of firms will be looking to business partners to help them use Gen AI, and that's what we're seeing happening. I'm going to go quickly just to encourage people to continue asking questions rather than saying ask questions and then just ignoring everyone. If we don't get through our questions, it's probably better that we answer everybody else's, right? There's a question, what resources, maybe this is a Zach thing, so what resources can you point us to help lawyers to understand the key terms and concepts around generative AI as that is relevant to lawyers?
Yeah, to actually the point that you were just talking about how this is going to appear within the legal industry, I do think that it will be embedded within a lot of the products that people already have. So, I mean, obviously we work for Thomson Reuters, but not just legal research or anything like that. I think it will be the same in discovery. I think it will be the same in contract technology. So as a result, I think that there is an opportunity not just to treat vendors as sales and a sales partnership, but an actual education partnership as well, because nobody is going to be closer to the technology than the technology vendors. It's going back to the research, but one of the things we asked is, who do you think will be the I forget exactly how we worded it, but the tastemakers, for lack of a better term, around generative AI. And a lot of people said it's going to be the clients expected, but it's also going to be the technology companies that are really driving this forward. So as a result, being able to lean on them, and not from a salesy standpoint, but from a, okay, brass tacks, what do I need to know about this standpoint, I think is going to be absolutely key.
I agree with you. I'm going to draw you back to the question, but I agree with you completely. I think that we'll get to a point where we don't even talk about what it is. I think that it will be Gen AI, but we don't go on and on about what it I think that eventually it will just have Gen AI in it and we'll stop. You know, someone described it as an analogy of, you know, you drive a car, you need to know how it gets from A to B. Does that get to A to B faster than their car? But you don't necessarily know how the engine works. I mean, that's perhaps slightly trivial example, but I think that it will get to the point where we don't obsess about what's, you know, whether we're using Gen AI. But to take you back quickly to that question, is there a good because questions are coming in quite fast, is there a good resource in terms of sort of educating, so what did I say? Yeah, resources you can point us to help lawyers understand key terms and concepts around generative AI. I mean, that's probably something that I should be doing.
I'll jump in on that one actually. So and again, I shouldn't apologize for kind of mentioning Thomson Reuters products, but we have some great guides and content on practical law related to this. And, you know, actually many of the editorial teams are sitting behind where I'm sitting at the moment. And so, you know, they've written extensively, and actually from the labs team, we've collaborated with them on some of this content around, you know, AI, like explainer guides and kind of what's the word like sort of language and terms and, you know, key terms and what they mean, as well as also, you know, the considerations for like procurement and, you know, the sort of different steps you should have in place as well. So, you know, I think that's a great place to start. And actually we have a one slider with links of relevant content that, you know, if we're sharing things after the webinar, I'll be happy to kind of see that sent around. We
will share. Okay, so let's I don't think I'm going to get any of my questions, which is great. It's a nice problem to have. So from registration, I'm just going to go through these in order because my brain can't cope otherwise. So assuming, actually there was a question above here. How can AI be used to improve PII compliance in contracts and policy drafting? Can it be used to verify compliance in other jurisdictions? I'm going to go through all of these questions. If there's ones that we want to come back to afterwards, by all means say. We can all chip in here. There's not any sort of, I guess that's probably an Andrew.
Yeah, and so I'll try and give an answer, although that's probably kind of quite a super specific question, which I feel I shouldn't sort of like give a definitive answer. But I think sort of so I mean, first of all, you know, when we think about generative AI, you know, I think most of us sort of think about, I ask a question, I get something back, that's kind of good and sort of meets my needs. But actually generative AI, you can deploy to kind of do different capabilities and things that you want to do. So, one of the things that, you can do is to ask it to extract certain language from things that you provide. So, you could put in your contracts and, ask it to identify the relevant PII or kind of language around that. Then act upon it, and actually that's not a sort of new capability that only generative AI can do. I'm sure people on this webinar will be very familiar with contract analysis tools and kind of different ways in which you can do that. And so I think what sort of generative AI can do is it sort of enables you to tackle some of that long tail of agreements that perhaps you might not have pre-trained AI capabilities for already. So I think, to go back to the question, AI can definitely be used to tackle that sort of problems and kind of ask natural language questions about, am I complying with regulations in certain jurisdictions? It doesn't sort of remove the need for you to kind of think and interrogate some of that detail to kind of ensure that it's meeting your needs. But generative AI is definitely a tool that adds value to that and similar use cases.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that, Andrew. If anything's too specific, we'll just come back to it afterwards, and either you can answer it or we'll find somebody to answer it. So where do you think we are with the legislation piece in Gen AI usage? Is that something that we can address now, or would you rather come back to it?
I can speak briefly. I mean, the EU AI Act is the largest one. If you have not read that yet, it's particularly around usage of or development of AI in particular, rather than necessarily usage, particularly on a law firm level. But it's still worthwhile to know since it just got passed, and it probably will be the basis for a lot of international AI regulation, both in the UK and the US upcoming. It's particularly for firms. I know in the US side, there have been some state bar associations that have started to put out guidance in California, in Florida. I've heard rumblings of the same in the UK, but I don't think anything is fully baked yet. So I would just watch out for that. Or honestly, especially if you're on this webinar, you're probably interested in the subject, getting involved, I think, is a great opportunity for a lot of lawyers that want to see the promulgation of technology, but want it to be used in a responsible and ethical way. Get involved with your local bar associations to say, hey, how are we adopting rules on this, and can I help?
Yeah. And actually, we've created on Legal IT Inside and legaltechnology.com a Gen AI dedicated page, and we're looking for content, really great content. So I'm just going to use this as a selling opportunity for me as well. I think we sort of touched on this question a little bit, like assuming we're past peak hype and now into the trough of disillusionment. I'm not sure we're there, but we were going to talk about this anyway. It's kind of fun. How long till we get onto the plateau of productivity? I mean, we have sort of talked about whether people are using it, talking about it. Is there anything to add on that?
I would agree that I don't think we're necessarily at the trough of disillusionment yet, just because it is relatively new technology. A lot of people are still kind of exploring it, really interested. The hype cycle is still up. I will say, though, that at least in my conversations, I'm finding people taking a skeptical eye toward this, which I actually think is a good thing.
Yeah.
In our research, we asked, so what is your sentiment toward generative AI? And it largely skewed more positive than negative, but the number one answer was hesitant. Not necessarily positive or negative, but people just wanted to see where this goes. So as a result, I don't think the trough of disillusionment will necessarily be that much of a trough compared to maybe some of the past implementations of AI in legal even. As for how long until we're at the plateau, that's anybody's guess. It really depends on adoption rates. And I think crucially, it really depends on the client side as well, how much this starts to get baked into RFPs and they really start to demand it out of their law firms, which then will drive adoption, which then will drive understanding of what it can do. But my personal opinion, not the TR opinion, but my personal is probably we're still a few years out from that.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on this one as well, because I think it's a really interesting point to think about how we kind of navigate from where we are today to like what that sort of future usage would look like. And I think, are we past the peak of, and I think it's peak of inflated expectations, they call it, isn't it? And I think sort of maybe not. I think sort of there is a kind of real danger when we talk about AI solving all our problems, that sort of actually you kind of imagine it doing anything you could possibly want. And so therefore, of course, you're going to crash into disillusionment because it's not going to do anything that you can imagine it could be. But I think sort of this is where, as legal professionals, people who are sort of highly thoughtful and kind of inquisitive, it's important when you're kind of using something that has AI embedded into it, that sort of you need to retain some expectations about, what are you expecting? What does good results look like? And, I think the reason why that is so critical is that, it's the sort of bias whereby if you don't have that sort of preconceived expectation about what you're expecting to see, then, anything you see back could look not bad, or, it's sort of taking you on your direction towards, this is something that I could use. And so actually kind of the real value comes from, where AI is able to either get you to where you want to get to faster, or you can do more than you could before, or, it's perhaps enabling you to kind of bring in or kind of bring in new concepts, new ideas that you perhaps hadn't thought of. So different ways in which you kind of identify value. And I think sort of part of that journey is, that critical thinking, as I said. But part of it is also about that sort of increasing familiarity and kind of use of tools that enable you to start to build trust. That's where the sort of productivity gains come from, is if you have that trust that you build with a particular tool, so that you can start to realize the benefits. Because otherwise, I think if you're sort of falling into the trap of expecting it to do everything, or falling into another trap of just using something blindly, then you sort of miss the benefits, or you kind of run risks that it's not going to deliver what you expect it will.
There's a big education piece, isn't there, at the moment? I think it's around, unlike AI Mark 1, as it were, where I think there was this genuine trough of disillusionment because everybody expected it to do far more. I think with the generative AI, we're seeing it do things that are incredible, but it's a case of really understanding how to get the results. It's not just a search and like a Google search. You actually understand how to understand prompts and all of this kind of stuff to get the right answer. So I think there'll be a lot of that involved in terms of either the tech vendors creating no-code, low-code solutions where they are helping us with the prompts, which obviously is something that you guys are doing, or else training people on how to get the most out of the technology. That seems to be a priority to make people understand, so that they don't sort of think, oh no, it's not working, when actually you're just not using it properly. So Zach mentioned that users may ask Pilot to write me an email without giving any client info, but are there any other obvious popular use cases that would help sell the adoption of Pilot into a firm as an introduction into Gen AI? Does he mean?
Yeah. Well, I think the question is just probably asking about general use cases right now, and especially for kind of what you were just talking about, change management. How do you get people on board? And I think that that's what's particularly cool about this tool is for reasons that we can get into, you don't want to be using ChatGPT for actual legal work, for client information in particular, but getting people to play around, like email is an easy one. You could also just say, hey, like, can you write me a first draft of, I don't know, a real estate contract? And it won't be pretty, it won't be a perfect contract, but it will give you a first draft. And just understanding the capabilities of not only this is what a document out of a generative AI tool would look like, but also the flip side of these are the holes, and these where I, as a legal professional, can come in and bring expertise and really perfect this, I think is particularly important. One thing about generative AI that I don't think people realize a lot of the time too is its ability to synthesize information, which I think is huge. Like one of the easiest use cases that, sorry, I'm just for an easy example, like on a meeting, get a meeting transcription from something like Teams, and then you can go into Copilot and say, hey, what are the 5 bullet points that I need to know from this meeting? And it will give you a summary with the top bullet points of the meeting that maybe you didn't remember because you zoned out halfway through. Just easy stuff like that, I think, can get people on board pretty quickly.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Do you think, I'm just gonna, there are lots of questions, keep them coming. I'm doing a really bad job of focusing on them anyway. I just wanted to take you to our point about change management, just briefly. So going from the sort of the hypothetical to the practical, you're saying that it's not necessarily even about just tech, it's about the whole change management piece.
100%. And I think that's particularly crucial with this technology that will be baked into pretty much everything within a few years. Any legal technology that you use, whether it's litigation, transactional, back office work, my guess is it will probably have some element of generative AI, but that can also scare people. So being frank in answering questions, even about, is this going to affect my work? Is there going to be job loss because of this? I think we're going to have to tackle those questions head on. And let's say, well, I mean, say I was talking to the American Association of Law Librarians not far long ago, and was telling them, like, yeah, generative AI within a few years could do a lot of librarian tasks, but that doesn't necessarily mean job loss. What it means is you are going to have to adjust how you work on a day-to-day basis to, there's an opportunity to be the experts of this technology, to make sure that you are using it correctly and training others within the firm. So as a result, I think that there's a lot of education that needs to be done, but also framing it as this is an opportunity for us to do things differently, to do things more efficiently, and to be more accurate in doing so. I think that there's something there.
Andrew, do you think so? I mean, that's a really good point. So at the moment, a lot of the conversations I have, we're saying it still needs a lot of oversight. You know, you can't just even, we will definitely before the end of the webinar come on to talk about the difference between ChatGPT and proprietary and why that's really important in terms of being grounded and all of that stuff. But just so would you say in terms of the results that people are getting, you know, obviously oversight is key, but would you think that will always be the case? Presumably this will just get better and better, and will it always need oversight, do you think?
So I mean, it's a really interesting question and a kind of a point that's worth kind of just sort of pausing and thinking about. So, you know, I think there's a couple of dimensions to that question. So one is what is the task that you are trying to do? So, you know, for tasks that are about ideation or kind of getting you something, you know, a starting point on the page where previously you had nothing, you know, I think there is kind of clear tolerance for things that, you know, are not necessarily factual, but, you know, where you sort of are expecting to kind of go in and sort of review them and, you know, that you can use some of the benefits that large language models bring in terms of, you know, having kind of lots of variety in the kind of language that they produce. There are then other tasks where, you know, there either is a right or a wrong answer, or you want to kind of base it very clearly on factually correct information. And so, you know, I think there are different kind of techniques and approaches to how you would sort of go about the latter, and certainly how we're going about them within Thomson Reuters. But to kind of get to that question around oversight, well, again, I think sort of there are a couple of dimensions to this. So one is that, I think you always would want to have some level of oversight. So, ultimately, if you're giving advice to a client, or kind of even if you're basing on facts, fundamentally kind of bringing that to the client in terms of the interpretation of how this applies to you, then you will need some level of human oversight, and maybe that will become lighter and lighter touch as our trust of these tools grows. But also you want to be able to kind of point to where your answer came from as well. And, that will kind of change and constantly evolve, because, the answers will want to draw on the latest information. And so I think, what maybe this is the right point to kind of mention, at Thomson Reuters, one of the ways that in which we're kind of focusing on those more factually led kind of use cases in our products like Westlaw and Practical Law, for example, is through something called retrieval augmented generation. And so that is essentially using our content as an input to the model, so that you're effectively saying, answer a question only using this content which I provided for you. And so that enables you to really enable to increase the accuracy, to kind of have increased confidence that the information has come from that source, and furthermore being able to kind of cite back to the sources that information came from. So this is like one of the major disadvantages that you would have if you ask the same question from a large language model that didn't have that retrieval augmented generation approach. So we've seen really sort of high performance and kind of quality of answers coming through that approach, which is kind of driving the bringing of that into our products. But even there, fundamentally, the checking is intended because you have that citation and the ability to go and interrogate the source. And it goes back to that question around trust, where you would always want to be saying, okay, here is the answer. Oh, I can see these sources that it cited, therefore I believe that to be correct. Or if you see something that doesn't seem quite right, then you have the ability to go and interrogate it. So I don't think you would ever want to remove oversight in that sort of situation. And so going back to something I think Zach mentioned, that is it, the end of lawyers. Well, I don't think it is, because you always need to have that validation and kind of confirmation that this is the right information for this particular context. That's where it's not going to go away.
Let's just keep on that topic briefly, and then we'll go back to some questions. But so you just already addressed the point about public versus proprietary large language models, and so you're saying that obviously your model is grounded only in your data. It won't go out and search the internet, and it will provide. Is that the right way? Did I describe it in the wrong way, Andrew? Did you just grimace at my description?
So that's correct for Westlaw and Practical Law. And I think part of what we're enabling with Copilot is the ability to kind of use that on kind of content that you provide as well. So there's probably not kind of a one size fits all answer to that question, but sort of it's certainly looking in those sorts of use cases to ground the answers in where that information came from. In the case of Westlaw and Practical Law, where that comes from Thomson Reuters content, but also looking at opportunities in other use cases where you'd want to ground it in your own content as well.
And is it the case that it will come back and say, I don't know the answer? You can, so rather than just, can we talk about hallucinations a little bit? Because obviously I think this is one of the things that frightens people. So they see these examples of the cases in New York where people have got these fabricated case law, and I think we talked about the trough of disillusionment. I do think that for a lot of people, it's still, they're frightened, actually. They're really frightened. And I think that it would help to clarify, you know, perhaps how you avoid, how you make sure that you can avoid that.
Yeah, sure. So, and I mean, first of all, I kind of, in the last year and a half, this notion that we're sort of talking about machines hallucinating is, I've had a very sort of sci-fi-esque concept. You know, it's sort of, and sort of, it shows how sort of our choice of language can sometimes humanize machines when, you know, they're machines rather than humans. But I think sort of, so certainly when we're kind of thinking about it from our product perspective, you know, it's the work that we do and the kind of the build that comes from the labs team and our partners in Thomson Reuters is about sort of the overall experience of how we're prompting the model. And that includes, you know, introducing our content to ground the answers, as I've said. You know, it also includes other pre and post processing steps, you know, which would include things like, you know, if we cannot find an answer from practical law, then come back and say there is not an answer in practical law, so that, you know, you're controlling for hallucinations there. You know, as a scientist, I would never say that, you know, that cannot happen. There is not a zero chance of hallucination, but, you know, we're kind of really tightly controlling for that, and you know, extensively testing it as we're kind of releasing our products. But, you know, one of the things that I think's I've sort of kind of educated myself on over the last year, that's kind of, I think, quite helpful and maybe sort of be useful to people on this webinar is, you know, why do hallucinations happen? And actually, if you look at a large language model like ChatGPT, you know, we should expect hallucinations because they are models that produce text in response to a prompt, and, you know, they're not inherently on their own. So I'm not talking about when they're integrated into products like at Thomson Reuters, but if on their own, when you go to ChatGPT, they are not speaking to the accuracy of the answer that they give you. And so the hallucinations, when something's being made up, you know, it's really kind of happening for kind of two primary reasons. One is you can see hallucinations when for the question you're asking, you know, the language that you would expect in the answer, you know, is not contained in the training data that went into that model. And for most use cases, because it's trained on essentially all the language on the internet, it's seen huge variety of language. And so, you know, it will have seen previous examples that will be appropriate. That's less so when we're talking about a specialized industry like legal, where for sure there's lots of legal language in ChatGPT, but, you know, there's also lots of nuance and specialization, including things that are not out there in the public, that would be in the training set. And then the second thing that brings about hallucinations is the context that you bring in your prompt. So, you know, one of the sort of rules of thumb is that the longer and more descriptive the prompt you give, you know, the more that you are controlling for what you expect. So, you know, that's why if you see a prompt, it might be like, you know, you are a junior lawyer in a UK-based firm, you know, who has experience in X, Y, and Z, and, you know, then goes on to, you know, ask the sort of question of, you know, maybe the contract you want to draft, like the example that Zach gave. And so, you know, that kind of context also kind of helps to control the hallucinations, but also, you know, the retrieval augmented generation that I approached, you know, what you're effectively doing is bringing really specific language and context into the prompt as well. So, you know, that's kind of two ways in which we control for it. But going back to your comment, you know, I can completely understand why people sort of view it as a scary thing and sort of are fearful that something will be made up. And that's why, you know, our approach has been really considered in how we've introduced it into, you know, particularly those research products like Westlaw and Practical Law.
That's really helpful. Thank you. With questions, we won't probably get time to answer them all, but we will answer them after if we don't get around to your question. And if either of you, Zach or Andrew, see a question that I I'm not reading out, by all means jump in and say you want to answer it.
Can I jump in with one actually? Because I saw one earlier on, which was in relation to you know, how data is used by model providers. And so I think, you know, this, I think maybe in his introduction today, Zach, you know, referenced, you know, stuff that's put into ChatGPT and then like is in the public domain. And, you know, we've also seen, you know, examples where people have got models to regurgitate data that they've been trained on or seemingly doing that anyway. And that sort of raises cause for concern. So, you know, I think certainly for us in Thomson Reuters, and, you know, I think anyone on this webinar who's, you know, engaging with, you know, one of the big cloud providers to access large language models themselves, you know, I think a key part of that is very clearly and explicitly having it that data that is used, you know, as either the input to the model or the output model, you know, is not used for training of the models in the future in any way. You know, that's something that we're sort of very you know, considered in doing. And I think everyone, if we're talking about educating ourselves, that's something that you should be very kind of cautious about and mindful about if you're using a large language model. And I think sort of then, you know, we're in a navigating ourselves to a future where, you know, yes, you want to make sure that you're not using your data or kind of the inputs that you put to a model to kind of train and benefit others, or, you know, of course, have any risk that that's going to be regurgitated for somebody else. But I think, you know, for us at Thomson Reuters, the main thing is to be really transparent in our terms about how data is being used, as well as how we are using AI in our products. But I think also once we sort of are being transparent and clear, also, you know, there's really valuable data which, you know, you yourselves in your firms or in your corporate legal departments may want to kind of use and kind of gain insight about, you know, typical ways in which you're, you know, drafting particular agreements or kind of treating particular situations. So I think the main thing is to be mindful about how that data is being used and by whom. And, you know, that does involve you having to be cautious about the terms and conditions that you're accessing and using a model. But, you know, I think sort of obviously when you're working with an organization such as ourselves, you know, we're sort of, I guess, taking care of that, and, you know, and kind of wrapping that into our terms and conditions. But if you're going out there and using a model from, you know, one of the big providers, then, you know, that's something that you should be asking for. And most of them do offer that, which, you know, in the very early days of ChatGPT, that was kind of the big downside, that there wasn't a clear route to do that.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
to that end too, I just want to note that there's a lot of talk around generative AI as being this big new thing that everybody has to approach differently, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. When you're talking about technologies that have been implemented in firms and corporate legal departments, there are always privacy questions, there are always security questions before you implement any tool. Like, think about cloud. There's so many security concerns, so many privacy concerns and in technology policies that many firms already have in place. You're not just going to go put a document on a public Dropbox. You're going to keep it under lock and key. And it's going to be a similar thing for generative AI, especially generative AI that are baked into products that you already use. So if you've done a security audit of something like a Westlaw, it's going to be a similar security audit that you're doing of Westlaw with generative AI. And it's important to not only ask those questions from the law firm or corporate legal department end, but to know how to ask those questions, what the questions are to ask. And probably you're going to be looking at past technologies to inform the future there.
It's a really good point, because actually when you think about when people started using the likes of Kira or any of the contract review technology, you know, when they would be saying, well, are other firms going to be benefiting? You know, are they going to be benefiting from my secret sauce in terms of, are you going to be, you know, training Kira or what other contract review systems now Latera? So I think it's a good point. I mean, it's a for most people, entirely new type of technology, but the questions are the same. It's a really good point. And you always have to really read the fine print, because people are getting, on occasion, caught out by the fact that, you know, they don't fully understand and they haven't read it and they haven't engaged. But like you say, that I think that's a really good point, Zach. There was a question about the types of we've been focusing very much on we're discussing, or all of the applications we're discussing are to support productivity. Do you have any use cases, or have you seen where AI can support actual skill acquisition, development, and or training? Is that a question for now?
Yeah, there's probably more that I could say than I should say, but I think it's definitely something that I've discussed with colleagues, and I think it's sort of it's a bit of a gap there today. And actually it's something that is a very common point that's raised. And I don't know if that was the intent behind this question, but sort of people are sort of very mindful of, well, if we're building tools that help people to get to answers quicker without sort of having to do the manual work, then how do they develop the skills and the know-how to to kind of be at that sort of senior practitioner where you do have that kind of knowledge. And so I think that's a kind of real opportunity. We've been experimenting with tools that kind of help our internal subject matter experts to upskill on prompting and to kind of have those sort of feedback loops so that you kind of take someone on that that kind of journey. But I also think that the sort of the fundamental ways in which you would kind of want to test the quality of a particular system are also the same ones that can help you to kind of upskill people. It's like everyone kind of increases their skill level of using a tool over time. So I think one sort of real opportunity might be to make that sort of feedback loop of how much manual work did you have to do versus how much how good was it sort of initially just when the system produced you an answer. I think sort of there's a real opportunity to kind of create those sort of feedback loops so that they can see their own skills increasing. So I think it's a really good point. I don't think anyone has solved that problem yet.
Yeah, and to Andrew's point, that's something we're seeing in the research as well. Less than 20% of legal professionals in our recent survey actually said that their organizations are providing any sort of training around AI or generative AI at all. So you can be a leader in this if it is something that you are trying to institute soon and get a leg up on the competition in doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need strong leadership. And what's really interesting, I do think that management are really involved and engaged, like where I've written about the law for years and years and technology for years and years. And often management haven't really been engaged, but I think now they are. So there's a real opportunity, I think to take the bull by the horns, as it were. This is a good product type question for you guys that I want to squeeze in. I do want to come to a quick bit of crystal ball gazing before we finish. But so what feedback are TR customers, what feedback are you getting from customers on efficiencies gained by Gen AI, enhanced case law research? Are folks finding the right cases quicker with this new tool? Are they finding the tool to be easy to use?
That's probably for me, isn't it? I think. So I think so I don't have like statistics to kind of drop in off the top of my head, but I think certainly in the extensive quality checks and the testing we did, it was kind of proving those speed benefits. So that's definitely something that we do see, and certainly kind of with the early adopter customers, that was something that was evaluated and checked. I think sort of one of the another sort of challenge and an opportunity space that I certainly see, just again, I guess my personal opinion is, for us to kind of continually get crisper in helping people to evaluate that question of, what is the difference between, what I get now versus if I went and did this manually, because, going back to something we talked about earlier, I don't think we would want to get away from that, quality checks and, the sort of human intervention as well. So I think certainly that's something that we, as I said, have evaluated, and, I think it will need to be a continued and ongoing basis, because AI systems don't sit still. You want to kind of constantly assure yourselves that, you know, you're getting performance benefits for your team over what they would otherwise do.
Thanks to everybody putting your thoughts in the chats as well. I'm not going to read everything out, but it's great to see a lot of engagement. I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball out before we go. I do think so. We're going to say talk about where does the legal industry go from here in trying to keep up with the pace of change. I think people are finding it exhausting. I'm not a negative person. I do think that people see the possibilities. They see they do see it's not all negative, but I do think it's so fast moving that you can't afford to just sit back. I personally, it's my personal opinion, you can't just sit back and just wait and see, which sometimes the legal sector takes that approach. We have done in the past. We've gone, well, we don't need to be leading, we're custodians of our clients' data and we're this, that, the other. And now we're seeing clients going, you use Gen AI or we fire you.
Yep.
I think it's a really interesting crossroads in terms of the way that particularly law firms approach this, but I'm kind of putting words in your mouth. So let's just ask you the question. So where does the legal industry, whatever that might mean, go from here in trying to keep up with the pace of change? Zach?
You nailed exactly where I was going to go, which is the client piece of this.
Okay.
So in our research, we found that less than 10% of clients are actually putting generative AI usage into RFPs and outside counsel guidelines right now. But on the flip side, more than half said, yes, we think our firm should be using this. And it's not even that their concerns aren't privacy, but they're the money of this. They want the efficiencies and they want their firms to not only have the legal expertise, but be able to do those repeatable tasks in a quicker, more accurate fashion. So where we're going, particularly in the near term, I think is exactly that. Because for as much as law firms are playing around with this, maybe they're not as loud about it, but corporate legal departments are doing the exact same. Maybe from people that we've talked to, might be even ahead of the law firms in terms of how they're understanding how this technology is going. So I think you're going to see more and more clients, particularly in the corporate side, asking that of their firms, which turns this not only to an internal efficiency question for firms, but a client service question. And are we doing work for our clients that we possibly can, which kind of reframes the conversation exactly to, as you were saying, Caroline, that it's not something that we can take our time with. It's now, are we actually keeping work, which is a different conversation.
I'd really love to talk more about what you're seeing from corporates in terms of whether they're going to bring more in-house. I don't know if we've got time. Like, I don't want to deprive Andrew of his crystal ball. Real quick, do you think, Zach, are you seeing corporates do you think they're going to start taking much more work in-house?
Yeah, we don't have the time, so I won't go far into it, but yes, I 100% see that coming in coming years.
Yeah. Well, 10 seconds on that topic is probably enough. It's really important or anything. Andrew.
Yeah, I hate crystal ball gazing, so I'll be brief. No, so I mean I think there's a real, no one wants to be the absolute first and the kind of trailblazers, but I think sort of now that we're sort of seeing adoption of tools, actually there is a real benefit and a need to not be left behind and to kind of build your familiarity with how to use these tools. What are they capability of, to kind of focus on where it can help you to be more productive. And I think sort of, I mean, it's not really that crystal ball gazing, but I think sort of one of the real genuine benefits that we see with generative AI is the ability to kind of stitch experiences together. So, you don't have to go and figure out for yourself, which tool do I use for this or that? It's sort of enabling it to kind of bring that context to you, which I think is a real pain point that people would otherwise have. And people talk about, this being the year of, agent-based approaches where, you configure a generative AI assistant to use different capabilities for different tasks, and a good example of that is, generative AI models are not that good at doing maths. And so kind of connecting it to say, when I want to sort of do this forecast, you go to a calculator and you kind of calculate it based on these inputs. And so I think in the same way, we will see really kind of beneficial assistants being created for people that stitch together a whole bunch of capabilities that are useful for people.
Yeah, okay. I feel like we've scratched the surface. It's such a big topic. I do feel like your feedback's been incredibly helpful. I thank you to everybody listening for your questions, and apologies if I didn't get to any, and we will definitely get to those afterwards. Thank you. I think that this is just going to be an ongoing, I think these kinds of conversations are so important, and sharing of ideas are going to be critical in 2024. And so I'm grateful to you both for taking the time to speak to me, and I'm grateful to people listening in for taking the time to join us today. So thank you everyone very much. It's been great chatting.
You as well.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.